Okay, we're going to start the second part of our lecture for our energy unit called energy transfer. So we're going to be referring a little bit to that first lecture. Okay, there's a few terms that we do need to be familiar with. The first one is metabolism. You may have heard people say, oh, she has a high or he has a low metabolism. And what that is it's focusing on the chemical changes, chemical reactions. And when it says the sum of, we're going to see that this is a cycle. We're going to have building and breaking down of molecules. Now this looks like a lot of text to read. I'm only going to point out a few key things, but you can pause it and read through it. Please don't write every single word down. Okay, I just thought it was a really good quote from this particular on-site biology book. But we talked about chemical reactions again, and it's going to take the food we eat, break that down, and then it's going to go through several different reactions through whatever we're needed in our daily activities. And we've seen calories before. Now there's a new word here that you may have heard of, but maybe just wasn't quite sure what it meant. Enzymes. So let me read the definition, then I'll try to explain it. Enzymes speed up these chemical reactions, so it could be any reactions in the body, by lowering the activation energy. Now, every chemical reaction has what's called an activation energy. How much energy is needed to start the chemical reaction process? That's all that means. Now, an enzyme will come along and lower that energy. So it will speed up the process. It makes it more efficient. So for example, let's say that I'm chewing food. Okay, in our mouth it starts the digestive process. You may have heard that in grade school. In our mouths, in saliva, there's an enzyme called amylase. That enzyme is going to help speed up the reaction of starting to break the food down along with our tongues moving the food and our teeth chewing it up. So that's what the enzymes do to help start breaking down those molecules by lowering the activation energy. So I just kind of gave it in a quick example. Do read in the book. If you need more information, of course, you always have the internet. You can look at that. Okay, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on enzymes. Okay, now back to metabolism. There are two parts to metabolism, and hopefully you've noticed that these pieces are dropping in. I'm adding to the word anabolism. I'm all about mnemonic devices, so ana, to add, to help you remember that. So I built the word, so you build complex molecules. So hopefully that'll help you remember it. Now here's a couple of examples. I would definitely make note of that. You may see this on the exam. And hopefully this looks familiar. Nucleotides, DNA or nucleic acids, amino acids to make protein. So these are our building blocks we talked about in our chemistry chapter, and these are macromolecules. So going through this process, and this illustration down here, this diagram, these are individual amino acids, and when I put them together with peptide bonds, it's going to make a polypeptide chain or a protein. So this is an example of the one part of metabolism called anabolism. The other half of it, and again it's a cycle, the other half is when I'm going to break down this complex molecule. So that's called catabolism, not cannibalism. Somebody wrote that on a test one time. I just thought that was so funny. Anyway, it's going to break down the molecules. So it's going to take these, here I just reversed this, so I've got protein in the meat, and through the digestive system it's going to make and break down amino acids. Here's a good example you may see on a quiz or a test. If I have a glucose molecule, so even though this is a building block to a macromolecule, it's still considered catabolism anytime I break it down into smaller elements or atoms. Anytime I break anything down into smaller pieces, that's catabolism. It doesn't necessarily mean going from the macromolecule down to the building blocks. Okay, so now I've got my glucose, and now I can even break it down into carbon dioxide and water. And that's through the process called cellular respiration. We're going to cover that more in depth second semester. Now here's for our visual people. We have large molecules. Sorry, it's a little blurry. So this could be like a macromolecule. It's going to break into little pieces. So these are our building blocks. That process is called catabolism. Now, if I look down here, if I take all these little pieces and glue them together, I add the pieces together, that's anabolism. So I make a larger molecule. Okay? Now, this image looks a little intimidating, but I'm going to walk you through it. First of all, we need to figure out what this is. So I have labeled up here a cell. So this is just the outline of a basic cell membrane. Here's the food. So we're going to eat the food. It's going to come into the cell. And the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to break those molecules down through the process or the pathway, the catabolic pathway. You notice the endings change? It's still the same process. Catabolism, catabolic pathway. So it's going to break down those molecules into all these little pieces, and these could be our monosaccharides, amino acids, nucleotides, and you notice it's giving off heat. We saw that in our last lecture. It's also going to give off energy. Now, if I come here to my other part, now I take all these little pieces that's in the cell, and now I start putting them back together differently. So you notice I've got A, B, C over here. Now I've got new molecules, new shapes, D, E, F. So now I take these pieces, and now I synthesize. That's another word for building or putting together. And now it's anabolic pathways or anabolism. Okay, and so these would be examples of carbs, protein, and DNA. So I think this is a really good example of the whole process of metabolism taking place in one cell, which it does happen all the time. Okay, now going kind of a larger scale, so if I was to look at just glucose, if you follow these arrows, I would take in starch and glycogen, which I would get from plants, okay, and other meat. So this would come for plants. This would come, the glucose, from animals eating meat, and it's going to come into the body, okay? Then looking at the blue arrows, I've got monosaccharides, fructose, glucose, galactose. Okay, so over here, the free energy is being moved out. Glycogen, the green arrows, that's going to be stored. Glycogen, that's our energy in our muscles. So here it's going to be stored in the muscle, and it's also going to be stored in the liver. Okay, so I'm not going to ask anything about the diagrams. If it just helps you visualize more on a larger scale, sometimes that makes it easier. Okay, now the second part of our lecture is with something called ATP. Sorry, I'm shifting here. Okay, ATP is what helps drive all those chemical reactions. So it's like you need to put batteries in your remote, you need to put batteries in anything that you use or plug it in. So ATP, what does that stand for? It is adenosine that's 3 phosphates. So if I break down those parts and figure out what it is actually a nucleotide, just like our DNA and RNA. But it has a few different pieces to it. It's going to have adenine, we saw that base before. It has a sugar called ribose, and it has a chain of 3 phosphates. Now this is going to change depending if it's ATP, ADP as in diphosphate, or AMP as in monophosphate. Now here's one diagram completely drawn out, the structure, chemical structure. You will not be asked to do that. And here's a very simplified structure. So here is my adenine, okay, just like over here. So now it's labeled adenosine, adenine. Okay, that's fine. Sugar is glucose, glucose. And then my phosphate groups, here's a phosphate. There's 1, 2, 3, and that's my ATP. Over here, this is really a lot cleaner to look at. So phosphate, 1, 2, 3. Okay? Now, how is ATP considered an energy transfer molecule. So let's relate it to something that we can understand a little bit easier. So when I need to contract the muscles, okay, it's going to send a signal by my nerves, and when it does that, it's going to go through chemical process breaking down that high energy molecule. That high energy molecule is called ATP. And so when I get the signal from the brain that carries through the nerves to that muscle, it's going to tell that muscle to contract or to relax. And that is the energy that's called ATP. So hopefully that makes a little more sense. So it's the energy that makes and drives particular structures. Okay, so it's involved in a chemical reaction, and what happens is this phosphate group, you remember that it had 3 phosphates for ATP, and then something we had free energy before. So when it breaks, that energy is going to be released. And just like before, it's going to be released in the form of heat. Remember the ecosystems, it was released in the form back into the environment. So what it does is, here's my 3 phosphates, here's my sugar, and here's my adenine. When this phosphate breaks off, it's going to create energy. That energy is released. So there would be like a fully charged battery, and when I start to use it, or I go to use it, it's going to release energy. And every time I use it and it releases more energy, it becomes depleted. And that would be equivalent to breaking off a phosphate. So here's just another diagram of what the ATP does. So you can see here in this diagram, here's my ATP, adenine, ribose, 3 phosphates, and it's going to release energy for the cell. Excuse me. That could be a muscle cell if it's contracting. And then it will need to recharge itself. So if you come down here, here's ADP, 2 phosphates, and in the cell it will pick up a phosphate and connect and recharge. It gets that energy to recharge itself from the food that we eat. Okay, so you can see how this is replenished. So here's the energy to do work, and then I recharge my batteries by eating food. Okay, so that ATP is continually being synthesized, which means building. So make sure you know that's another word for building, and broken down. So it's a continuous cycle. So anytime I break something down, just kind of review from the beginning, that's catabolic or catabolism. And anytime that I synthesize or build, in this case, I'm going to make ATP from ADP by adding the phosphate, which is right here, and then that's going to be anabolic or anabolism. So I add a phosphate. Okay, there's just another diagram. You know, if you want to read this, it's fine. I really like this description here, so scientific, that breaking down ATP releases energy and cells constantly replace their AT by whacking a spare phosphate onto ADP. So I didn't know that was a technical term for whacking. I guess I learned something every day. But the energy that comes from food we eat, whether it's in animals or if you make your energy as plants do, okay, that's where the energy comes from. So even plants have ATP and ADP. So here's these enzymes again to show that it's linked to ATP. So enzymes help control the breaking and making of ATP. And remember, I just recopied the definition. It's going to control or speed up those chemical reactions. So it would help to quickly recharge this battery more efficiently so I can better use it. Okay, now ATP is going to supply energy for, and we're just going to focus on the cellular level. What it's going to do is it's going to bring in nutrients. So this is really a basic cell, has a lot of parts on it that you may not find on every cell. So it'll bring in the nutrients after I break the macromolecules down. Any waste that accumulate in the cell will be removed, so it'll be like taking out your trash. Cell division, we'll look at that second semester, but that will take place in the nucleus. You may have heard that called mitosis or meiosis. And then movement, and that's the reason I chose this diagram of the cell, is because it also had a flagellum, or you can have cilia. Some cells, not all, will have an appendage coming off that will help it to move through whatever environment. So there could be some ATP in this flagellum. And the best example, as far as in the humans or the mammals, would be sperm. So sperm has a flagellum, and it has a midpiece, which is just packed full of ATP, and its job is to help it swim. Okay, so this will be the final part. So ATP is not a long-term storage. So just like batteries, they're going to deplete, and so I always use the example of rechargeable batteries. So when it's fully charged, it's the ATP, high energy, and after you use it for a while, it starts to decrease. I use it up, I lose a phosphate, and then now it's low energy, or ADP. When you get down to AMP, that's pretty much drained. Okay, another way you can look at this, not long-term storage, would be equivalent to eating a candy bar before you do an activity. You have a lot of energy right at the beginning, high energy, but then after a while, you have kind of a sugar crash. So that would be your low energy, using up those phosphates. Now, I'm not going to ask you anything about how many times ATP is consumed and regenerated, just to stop and think about how fast it's doing this in every cell, every part of our body. Right now, just sitting there, every cell, 10 million molecules of ATP is consumed and regenerated. So that's that cycle going through ATP, ADP, per second per cell. So just kind of, that's a lot of ATP being consumed and regenerated. Okay, so that is a much shorter lecture. Hopefully, if you didn't make sense of anything, you might want to go back to your book and add those to your Q notes. Otherwise, we'll do some activities in class to hopefully make more sense of this. I'll see you next time.